Wind River Valley, Wyoming Territory, February 1835. Jonas Fletcher knelt by his stone fireplace at dawn, stirring embers that had barely lasted the night. His breath formed clouds inside the cabin. The logbook on the rough-hewn table showed the damning arithmetic. 4 cords of firewood burned in January alone, double what any trapper should need for a 14 by 16-foot structure. His 2 children coughed through the frost-covered bedding. The midwife had visited 3 times that month. Fletcher had built the cabin using standard methods learned in Virginia: logs notched tight with clay and moss chinking, a stone hearth against the north wall. Every trapper in the Rockies built that way. Fast? Adequate. Proven. But adequate meant his family shivered at 8,000 feet while he hauled timber until his hands bled. They didn't yet know that a carpenter's obsession with rising heat would turn one desperate winter into a regional revolution in frontier shelter. Wind River Valley sits cradled between granite peaks that funnel Arctic air straight down from the Continental Divide. By November 1834, Jonas Fletcher had joined a trapping brigade heading west from St. Louis, part of the final wave chasing beaver pelts before silk hats killed the trade. He was 32 years old. He'd apprenticed as a carpenter in Richmond, framing timber structures with mortise and tenon joints, but he'd never stacked logs. The site he chose showed decent judgment. Southern exposure. A cold spring 200 yards down the slope. Cottonwood and lodgepole pine within dragging distance. Valley walls that might block the worst northwest gales. He started cutting in late August when the sun still warmed the high meadows. His first mistake was speed. He felled 60 logs in 3 weeks, working alone, cutting whatever stood close and straight enough. He left the bark on because stripping it seemed like wasted daylight. He didn't season the timber. The fir brigade was moving on, and he needed shelter before snow. The notching went fast. Simple saddle joints at the corners, a technique he'd watched another trapper demonstrate once. Each log settled into the one below with a satisfying thunk. By mid-September, the wall stood 7 feet high. He chinked the gaps with clay from the creek bank, moss pulled from shaded rocks, and prairie grass stuffed into the wider splits. The mixture went on wet and looked solid. The fireplace took another week. He hauled river stones and stacked them against the north wall, where the ground was flattest. The firebox was adequate. The chimney drew smoke. He built a door from split planks and hung it on leather hinges. One small window, covered with greased paper, let in dim light. The floor was packed earth. The roof was poles overlaid with bark and a thin layer of sod. Total construction time, 21 days. Total cost in materials purchased, roughly $18 for the filing fee, some iron, nails, and a small pane of actual glass he later decided not to install. He moved in on October 7, 1834, proud of his speed. The first night was cold but manageable. He built a fire. The cabin warmed. He rolled out his bedding near the hearth and slept soundly. By November, the unseasoned logs had begun to shrink. Green wood loses up to 10% of its diameter as it dries. Gaps opened between the courses. The clay chinking cracked in the freezing nights and crumbled during the day. The moss dried to powder and fell out. The grass-stuffed voids became tunnels for mice. The bark, which he'd left on for speed, held moisture against the wood. Rot started at the contact points. Insects found homes beneath the rough surface. Every time the temperature cycled through freezing, ice formed in the bark layers and pried the logs slightly apart. But the worst problem was invisible to Fletcher at first. The stone fireplace sat against the exterior north wall. Half its warmth radiated outward into the coldest air. The rising heat from the fire had nowhere to go except straight up the chimney or against the icy logs. The cabin had no thermal mass inside the insulated envelope, no way to store heat, no strategy for circulation. December brought the first serious cold. Temperatures dropped to 10 below zero, for 3 straight nights. Fletcher burned through half a cord of wood trying to keep the interior above freezing. He could watch frost creep across the inside walls despite the roaring fire. His water bucket froze solid 3 feet from the hearth. He started cutting firewood in earnest. Every day he hauled and split timber until his shoulders burned. He stacked cords against the cabin's exterior wall. By the end of December, he'd burned through 2.5 cords. A properly built cabin of similar size should have needed 1 cord for the entire month. His hands developed open cracks from the cold and the constant labor. His back ached from hauling. But worst was the knowledge that he was failing. The cabin he'd built so quickly was barely adequate. His family, a wife and 2 young children who joined him in late November, suffered through nights where their breath froze on the blankets. The cold never let up. January brought storms that buried the valley under 4 feet of snow. Fletcher spent entire days just reaching his woodpile and dragging split logs back to the door. Inside, the fire burned constantly. The stone hearth glowed red. The temperature near the fireplace reached tolerable levels, but 6 feet away, frost formed on the interior walls. His wife hung blankets from the ceiling rafters, trying to partition the cabin and trap heat near the sleeping area. It helped marginally. The children, ages 4 and 6, developed persistent coughs, wet, rattling sounds that worsened at night when the temperature dropped and moisture condensed on every surface. The midwife visited on January 9th, then again on January 23rd, then February 6th. Each time she examined the children, noted the damp conditions, and recommended keeping them warmer. Fletcher wanted to laugh. Keeping them warmer meant burning more wood, which meant more hours hauling and splitting, which meant less time trapping the beaver that was supposed to justify this entire venture. By mid-February, Fletcher was burning 4 cords per month, roughly 1 cord every 7 days. At that rate, his woodpile would be exhausted before spring. He'd already cut every dead standing timber within a 1/4 mile. Now he was felling live trees, which burned less efficiently because of their moisture content. The arithmetic was brutal. A cord of wood represented roughly 128 cubic feet of stacked timber. To produce 1 cord, Fletcher needed to fell trees, limb them, section them into 16-inch lengths, split the sections, and stack the results. Working alone in deep snow, this took approximately 3 full days of hard labor per cord. 4 cords per month meant 12 days of wood cutting. Add the daily hauling, dragging split wood from the stack to the cabin, sometimes through waist-deep drifts, and he was spending roughly half his time just keeping the fire fed. Meanwhile, his trap line sat unattended. Beaver pelts, which should have been his primary focus, went uncollected. The financial logic of his homestead was collapsing under the weight of inadequate shelter. He wasn't alone in this struggle. Other trappers in the valley faced similar problems. Most had built cabins even faster than Fletcher's, with less care. Some spent entire winters essentially camping indoors, their structures offering little more protection than a canvas tent. But Fletcher had his carpentry background. He'd learned to frame buildings, to think about how structures bore weight and shed weather. And increasingly, as he fed the fire and watched heat pour uselessly up the chimney, he began to think about heat itself. Heat rose. Everyone knew that. The hottest air in the cabin was always near the ceiling. If you climbed to the rafters, the temperature might be 20 degrees warmer than at floor level. But that heat never came back down. It just accumulated uselessly overhead until it escaped through gaps in the roof or radiated through the logs. Meanwhile, the sleeping area, raised 2 feet off the ground on a simple platform, stayed bitterly cold. His children slept under piles of blankets and still woke shivering. The damp cold triggered their coughs. The coughs led to the midwife visits. The cycle continued. Fletcher started sketching ideas in his logbook. What if he could trap that rising heat? What if there was a way to capture the warmth that pooled uselessly near the ceiling and redirect it to where his family slept? The problem gnawed at him through the rest of February. Every morning, as he stirred the embers and added fresh wood, He thought about circulation, about capturing rising air, about building something above the sleeping platform that might hold warmth through the night. Spring arrived slowly in the Wind River Valley. By late March 1835, the worst cold had broken, but snow still covered the ground 3 feet deep in the shaded areas. Fletcher had survived his first mountain winter, but barely. He'd burned through roughly 18 cords of wood, 6 times what a well-built cabin should have required. His children's health had deteriorated. The persistent coughs had developed into something more serious by early March. One child ran a fever for 4 days straight. The midwife stayed in the cabin for 2 nights, doing what little frontier medicine could offer. The child survived, but Fletcher understood how close he'd come to losing them. In early April, a Swedish trapper named Niels Bergström stopped at Fletcher's cabin while passing through the valley. Bergström had been working the Rocky Mountain beaver streams since 1822. He was one of the old-timers who'd seen everything and survived it all. Bergström looked at Fletcher's cabin with the practiced eye of someone who knew exactly what he was seeing. He walked around the structure, studying the exterior walls. He pushed on logs, testing their tightness. He examined the chinking, most of which had failed. He looked at the fireplace position. He checked the roof. Finally, he shook his head. "You are cold here," Bergström said. It wasn't a question. Fletcher didn't bother denying it. "Colder than I've ever been. Can't figure why. Logs are tight. Got a good fire." Bergström explained it in the straightforward manner of someone who'd learned these principles through hard experience. Heat moved in specific ways, he said. It radiated from hot surfaces like fire or sun-warmed stone. It conducted through materials, faster through some than others. And it rose, which was why ceiling areas stayed warmer than floors. The problem with Fletcher's cabin was that every one of these heat movements worked against him. The fireplace radiated half its warmth straight outside through the north wall. The rising heat escaped through roof gaps Fletcher hadn't sealed properly. The log walls, which seemed solid, actually conducted heat away faster than the fire could replace it. And the cabin had no mass inside to hold warmth after the fire died down. "In old country," Bergström said, "we learned how to keep warm long ago. You build the heat storage inside house, not outside. Fireplace must be in center, or at least not touching outer walls. Mass of stone must be surrounded by warm air so it holds warmth and gives back slowly through night." He described the best cabins he'd seen in the Rockies. They positioned fireplaces in the interior when possible. They used double-wall construction in the coldest areas, 2 layers of logs with packed earth or sawdust between them for insulation. They sealed every gap with proper chinking, using materials that wouldn't crack. They built with seasoned logs that wouldn't shrink and open new gaps. Fletcher listened carefully. He'd already been planning to rebuild. Everything Bergström told him confirmed his instincts and added crucial details. But Bergström mentioned something else that caught Fletcher's attention. Some trappers, he said, built sleeping lofts in their cabins. Not full second floors, but raised platforms with slatted construction that allowed warm air to rise through and accumulate in a defined space. If you slept in that space, you stayed warmer. Some had even figured out ways to push that trapped warm air back down into the main living area using simple fans powered by the draft from the stove. Fletcher's mind started racing. A loft structure to trap rising heat, a circulation method to move that warmth back where it was needed. This wasn't just insulation, this was active heat management using the natural tendency of warm air to rise. That night, after Bergström continued on his journey, Fletcher sat by the fire and began sketching in earnest. Not a complete rebuild, he couldn't afford that, but a modification, an addition, a slatted platform above the sleeping area designed specifically to capture and hold rising heat. And perhaps, if he could figure out the mechanics, a simple fan to circulate that trapped warmth back down. The solution wasn't more firewood, the solution was using the heat he already produced more efficiently. By June 1835, Fletcher had his design worked out. The concept was simple in theory, but would require careful execution. He would build a slatted loft structure above the existing sleeping platform. The slats would allow warm air to rise through while creating a defined space where that heat could accumulate. The key innovation was circulation. Warm air would rise naturally into the loft space, but without a method to push it back down, the heat would just sit there uselessly. Fletcher's solution was a small paddle fan mounted on an iron axle positioned in the stovepipe's rising heat. The draft itself would turn the fan, which would push warm air from the loft back down into the living space. He started by cutting additional timber. This time he selected carefully. Lodgepole pine, as straight-grained as he could find, felled in late spring when sap flow was minimal. He stripped every log immediately and let them season in the sun for 3 weeks before beginning construction. The existing sleeping platform was already raised 2 feet off the floor, a simple construction of split logs laid across support beams. Fletcher built upward from there. He erected 4 corner posts, each 8 inches in diameter, that extended 6 feet above the platform. Crossbeams connected the posts at the top, creating a frame. For the loft floor, he used smaller diameter poles laid perpendicular to the platform below, spaced 3 inches apart. This slatted construction was crucial. The gaps allowed warm air to rise through, while still providing a solid sleeping surface. He laid split planks across the poles, also spaced with gaps, creating layers that would trap progressively warmer air as it rose. The entire loft structure occupied roughly 1/3 of the cabin's interior space, approximately 5 feet by 10 feet. It created a defined airspace above the sleeping area where warm air could accumulate and stratify by temperature. The warmest air would collect at the very top. Slightly cooler air in the middle. The loft sleeping surface would sit in a zone significantly warmer than the main cabin floor. The fan mechanism required more ingenuity. Fletcher took a section of split plank and carved it into 4 blades, each roughly 8 inches long. He mounted them on an iron axle, salvaged from a broken wagon wheel he'd found abandoned along the trail. The axle ran through a section of hollowed log that served as a bearing, allowing the fan to spin freely with minimal friction. He positioned this assembly in the rising heat column of the stove. The stovepipe created a natural draft, hot air and smoke rising rapidly toward the roof. By placing the fan in this column, the moving air would catch the blades and turn them continuously as long as the fire burned. The fan's purpose was to push accumulated warm air from the loft space back down into the main cabin. Fletcher angled the blades to catch rising heat and redirect it in a downward arc. The effect wouldn't be dramatic. This was a simple wooden paddle fan, not a modern mechanical blower. But even modest air movement could help circulate warmth that would otherwise remain trapped. He also added a small adjustable vent near the roof peak. In winter, this would stay closed, trapping warm air. In summer, he could open it to let hot air escape, preventing the cabin from becoming unbearable during the brief warm months. The construction took most of June and July. Fletcher worked methodically, fitting each piece carefully. He used wooden pegs for most joints, reserving his limited supply of nails for critical connections. The corner posts were mortised into the existing platform structure, creating a rigid frame that wouldn't sag or shift. By early August, the loft was complete. From inside the cabin it looked unusual, a raised platform with visible gaps between the floor slats, corner posts extending to the ceiling, and a crude wooden fan spinning slowly in the stove's rising heat. Other trappers who stopped by to trade looked at it skeptically. It seemed like wasted effort and materials for a dubious benefit. But Fletcher understood what they didn't. He'd spent an entire winter watching heat pour uselessly toward the ceiling while his family froze below. This structure was designed to capture that waste and make it work. The real test would come when winter returned. Through August and September, Fletcher refined his design. He observed how the fan performed in different conditions, adjusting the blade angle to maximize airflow. He experimented with blocking and unblocking the roof vent to understand its effect on circulation. He took detailed notes. The temperature log he kept became the key document for understanding what was happening. Using a simple mercury thermometer he'd purchased in St. Louis before heading west, Fletcher took readings at different heights in the cabin. Floor level, 3 feet up, 6 feet up at the main living area, then inside the loft at the sleeping surface. Finally, at the very top of the loft space near the ceiling. The stratification was dramatic. On a typical evening with the fire burning, floor-level temperature might read 48 degrees. 3 feet up, 56 degrees. Main living area at 6 feet, 62 degrees. Loft sleeping surface, 70 degrees. Top of loft space, 76 degrees. The 28-degree difference between floor and ceiling represented wasted heat in a standard cabin. But with the loft structure capturing that warmth at the sleeping level, Fletcher's family would experience conditions radically better than the previous winter. The fan's effect was subtler but measurable. When it spun actively, pushing warm air downward, the lower temperatures increased by 3 to 5 degrees. Not revolutionary, but meaningful. That circulation prevented the coldest air from settling permanently at floor level and reduced the total temperature gradient across the cabin's height. Fletcher also noticed secondary benefits. The improved air circulation reduced moisture condensation. In his first winter, damp had been almost as much a problem as cold. Frost formed on walls. Bedding grew damp. The wet, stagnant air contributed to his children's respiratory problems. Now, with air moving continuously between the loft and the main space, moisture had less opportunity to condense. The warmer temperatures in the sleeping area meant less dramatic temperature differentials when warm breath hit cold surfaces. The cabin felt drier. He also observed that the loft structure itself provided acoustic dampening. The multiple layers of slatted wood absorbed sound, making the cabin interior quieter. Wind noise decreased. The fire's crackle became less harsh. These weren't planned benefits, but Fletcher appreciated them. As October arrived and the first cold nights returned, Fletcher prepared methodically. He'd cut and stacked 12 cords of firewood over the summer, significantly more than the 18 cords he'd burned the previous winter, but he was planning for worst-case scenarios. The wood was properly seasoned. The stacks were protected from snow by bark covers. He re-chinked the cabin walls using an improved mixture. Clay from the creek bank, yes, but now mixed with fine sand for structure and horsehair for tensile strength. He'd traded with a passing homesteader for a bag of horsehair trimmings. Mixed into the clay, the hair created a matrix that resisted cracking even when frozen and thawed repeatedly. Sealed every gap he could find. The spaces around the door, the window frame, the roof edges where poles met logs. He used pine resin boiled down to a sticky tar for waterproofing the most exposed areas. The fireplace he left as built. He couldn't move the stone structure without tearing down and rebuilding entirely. But he made one modification. He built a small stone bench extending into the cabin from the hearth. This added thermal mass inside the heated space. The stone would absorb warmth during the day and release it slowly through the night. By mid-October, the preparation was complete. The cabin was sealed. The woodpile was stacked. The loft structure was finished and tested. The fan spun steadily whenever the fire burned. Fletcher felt as ready as preparation could make him. The children had recovered from their winter illnesses. They were healthy, active, and clearly excited about sleeping in the new loft space. Fletcher's wife, skeptical of the entire project initially, had come around after seeing the temperature differences Fletcher documented. On October 23, 1835, the first serious cold front arrived. Temperature dropped to 18 degrees overnight. Fletcher lit the fire in the evening and let it burn down to coals by midnight. The family slept in the loft. Morning temperature at sleeping level, 64 degrees. Floor level, 49 degrees. The loft had worked exactly as designed. Fletcher recorded in his log, "First true test successful. Children warm through night. Single fire sufficient." Winter 1835 to 1836 proved the design absolutely. November brought a series of cold snaps. Temperatures dropped below zero for extended periods. Snow accumulated steadily, reaching 4 feet deep by mid-month. The conditions matched or exceeded the previous winter's severity. But inside Fletcher's cabin, the experience was transformed. The family slept comfortably in the loft space where trapped warm air kept temperatures stable. The fan circulated heat continuously, preventing the brutal cold pockets that had characterized the previous year. And most significantly, firewood consumption dropped dramatically. By December 1st, Fletcher had burned approximately 1.5 cords, less than half his consumption rate from the previous year. The mathematics were clear. The loft wasn't just making the cabin more comfortable, it was drastically reducing the fuel needed to maintain livable conditions. This had cascading effects. Less firewood needed meant fewer days spent cutting and hauling timber. That meant more time for productive work, checking trap lines, processing pelts, hunting for meat. The economic logic of the homestead finally started working. The health impacts were even more striking. The midwife, Hannah Coulter, maintained a visiting log where she recorded her calls to various families in the valley. In the winter of 1834 to 35, she'd visited the Fletcher cabin 11 times. Most visits were for the children's respiratory illnesses, but she'd also come for general wellness checks when the family seemed to be struggling. Winter 1835 to 36. 3 visits. 1 for a minor injury unrelated to the cabin conditions. 2 routine wellness checks. No respiratory emergencies. No desperate calls in the middle of freezing nights. Coulter noticed the difference. When she visited in early January 1836, she specifically asked Fletcher what had changed. He showed her the loft structure and explained the heat circulation principle. She examined the sleeping area, noting the warmer temperatures and drier conditions. She asked detailed questions about construction and materials. "This needs to be in every cabin in the valley," she said flatly. "Half the children I see are sick from the cold and damp. If this prevents that..." She left with sketches and notes. Within 2 weeks, she discussed the design with 3 other families she visited regularly. The word spread differently than Fletcher expected. He'd assumed other trappers, the men building cabins and managing homesteads, would be the primary audience for his innovation. But it was women, particularly those like Coulter who moved between families and saw the health consequences of poor shelter, who became the most effective advocates. When a homesteader's wife heard from the midwife that the Fletcher children had stopped getting sick after a cabin modification, that carried weight. When multiple families with loft-modified cabins reported improved health and reduced firewood consumption, the evidence became undeniable. By February 1836, at least 3 other cabins in the immediate valley had incorporated some version of Fletcher's design. The specifics varied. One trapper built a simpler version without the fan, just using the slatted platform to create a warm sleeping space. Another built a more elaborate loft that occupied nearly half the cabin's interior volume. A third incorporated the concept into a new cabin under construction, designing the structure from the beginning around heat stratification. All reported similar results: warmer sleeping conditions, reduced firewood needs, better health, particularly for children and elderly family members. Fletcher himself spent that winter observing and documenting. He maintained his temperature log, recording readings at various heights and times. He tracked firewood consumption precisely. He noted weather conditions and correlated them with cabin performance. The data was unambiguous. On the coldest nights, when exterior temperature dropped to 20 below zero, the loft sleeping area maintained a minimum temperature of 58 degrees with a moderate fire that burned down to coals by midnight. Floor level might drop to 40 degrees, but that was a dramatic improvement over the near-freezing conditions of the previous winter. Firewood consumption for the entire winter, 9 cords. Half what he'd burned the year before. The difference represented roughly 45 days of labor saved, time he could spend on productive work instead of desperately hauling timber. The children's coughs didn't return. They slept comfortably, played actively during the day, and showed none of the listless exhaustion that had characterized the previous winter. Fletcher's wife noted the change in her own health as well. Less fatigue, fewer headaches, better sleep quality. The loft hadn't just improved their shelter, it had fundamentally changed their survival odds. As winter deepened, Fletcher began receiving visitors specifically to see the loft design. Word had spread beyond the immediate valley. Trappers passing through on their way to trading posts or between trap lines would detour to examine the modification. Some were skeptical. Others immediately grasped the principle and began planning their own versions. One visitor in late January 1836 was particularly significant. A French-Canadian trapper named Baptiste Marot arrived with his Shoshone wife, Morning Crow. They were moving through the territory and had heard about the cabin that stays warm without burning a forest. Morning Crow examined the loft structure with interest, then laughed, not mockingly, but with recognition. "We do this," she said in the mixture of Shoshone, French, and English that served as trade language. Not same, but same idea. Warm air rises. You trap it where people sleep. Smart. She described how her people built winter lodges, not permanent log structures like white trappers favored, but sophisticated temporary dwellings designed for specific climates. In the coldest regions, they'd build with double layers, an inner and outer wall with insulating material between. They'd dig partially underground, using earth itself as insulation, and they'd often create raised sleeping platforms where warm air would naturally accumulate. "White men build cold houses," she continued. "You make walls that fight the warmth instead of holding it. This," she gestured at Fletcher's loft, "this understands." Fletcher listened carefully. He was beginning to realize that his invention wasn't entirely novel. Indigenous peoples had been solving these problems for generations using different materials and methods, but based on the same understanding of heat behavior. His contribution wasn't discovering new principles, but applying them to log cabin construction in ways that other white trappers could easily replicate. Morning Crow and Baptiste stayed for 2 days, weathering a storm. During that time, Morning Crow shared other insights about winter shelter design. The importance of moisture management, how damp air made cold more dangerous. The value of sleeping surfaces raised off the ground, away from earth-coupled cold. The benefit of small, defined sleeping spaces that could be kept warm more easily than large, open volumes. Fletcher absorbed everything, making notes and sketches. Some of these principles he'd already implemented instinctively. Others were new ideas he could incorporate. When they left, Morning Crow gave Fletcher a piece of advice. "Your loft is good, but your fire is still wrong. It sits against cold wall, sending warmth outside. If you rebuild, put fire in center. Let stone hold warmth inside house. This you should do." She was right. The fireplace position remained Fletcher's fundamental limitation. He'd worked around it with the loft, but the core inefficiency remained. If he ever had opportunity to rebuild completely, he'd follow Bergstrom's and Morning Crow's advice and position thermal mass in the cabin's interior. But for now, the loft modification had solved his immediate survival problem, and increasingly, it was solving the same problem for others. By March 1836, Fletcher estimated that at least 8 cabins within a 15-mile radius had incorporated loft structures. Some were simple raised sleeping platforms with slatted construction. Others included circulation fans or more complex air management systems. The specifics varied based on each builder's skills and available materials. What they shared was the underlying principle: Capture rising warm air at sleeping level instead of letting it waste against the ceiling. This simple concept, rigorously applied, cut firewood consumption by 30 to 50% and dramatically improved living conditions. Fletcher began to understand something important. His innovation wasn't the loft itself, it was the documentation and explanation. Indigenous peoples had understood these principles for centuries. Some European building traditions incorporated similar ideas. But in the American frontier context, among log cabin builders who mostly worked from rough practical knowledge without theoretical understanding, the concept hadn't propagated effectively. By creating detailed sketches, maintaining temperature logs, and explaining the heat flow principles in simple terms, Fletcher had made the knowledge transmissible. Other trappers could look at his design, understand why it worked, and replicate it with confidence. This documentation impulse came from his carpentry background. Carpenters worked from drawings and specifications. They understood buildings as engineered systems, not just piles of materials. Fletcher applied that mindset to frontier shelter and created something that could spread systematically rather than through random chance. The spring of 1836 saw increased construction activity in the valley. Multiple families began building improved cabins incorporating what was increasingly called the ladder loft, a reference to the slatted construction that resembled a horizontal ladder. The term stuck, spreading with the design itself. Fletcher's cabin had become an informal reference standard, a place visiting trappers could examine to see how the principles worked in practice. Spring also brought requests for Fletcher to help others build loft modifications. He assisted 3 families directly, working alongside them to implement the design. This hands-on teaching revealed important lessons about adaptation. Not every cabin could support the same loft design. Differences in roof height, floor space, existing structural elements, and available materials meant each installation required modification. Fletcher found himself becoming less a designer of a single solution and more an explainer of principles that others could apply to their specific situations. He started creating a standardized material list and instruction set for a basic loft modification. This document, which he wrote out longhand and allowed others to copy, became one of the earliest how-to guides for frontier cabin improvement. The basic materials for a minimal loft structure: 4 corner posts, 8 inches diameter, 8 feet length, 6 cross beams, 4 inches diameter, length matching cabin width, 20 to 30 slatting poles, 2 inches diameter, cut to span between cross beams. Split planks for sleeping surface, quantity depending on desired coverage. Wooden pegs or iron nails for joinery. Clay, sand, and horsehair for additional chinking if needed. Materials for optional fan. 1 paddle-shaped blade section, 1 iron axle or sturdy wooden pin, 1 hollowed log bearing. Time required for 1 man working alone, approximately 12 days from start to completion. Total material cost, if purchased, roughly $7 to $9, mostly for iron hardware if used. If built entirely from available timber with wooden joinery, near zero monetary cost, but 20 to 30 additional hours of work for peg making and joint fitting. Fletcher's time log showed the breakdown. Days 1 through 3, cutting and preparing timber. Days 4 through 6, building corner post framework and crossbeam structure. Days 7 through 9, installing slatting and sleeping surface. Days 10 through 11, adding fan mechanism and adjusting blade angle. Day 12, final chinking and weatherproofing. This documentation proved valuable. Families considering the modification could see exactly what was involved: materials, time, and labor. The investment was substantial but not impossible. A man working steadily could complete the project in under 2 weeks. The resulting fuel savings would repay the time investment within the first winter. Fletcher also began tracking the broader economic impact. His own firewood savings, 9 cords instead of 18 the first winter with the loft, represented roughly 45 days of labor saved annually. At a conservative estimate of a trapper's time being worth $2 per day in beaver pelts or other productive work, that was $90 in recovered value per year. The loft construction had cost approximately 12 days of work, equivalent to perhaps $24 in opportunity cost. Single winter payback period. Every subsequent winter represented pure savings. This economic argument proved persuasive to practical-minded frontiersmen. They might be skeptical of novel designs or theoretical heat flow principles, but they understood labor time calculations and fuel costs. When Fletcher could show that the loft paid for itself in one season and saved money indefinitely afterward, adoption accelerated. By summer 1836, Fletcher estimated that 15 to 20 cabins in the broader region had implemented loft modifications. The design continued evolving. Some builders created L-shaped lofts that wrapped around interior corners. Others built full-width lofts that divided cabins into distinct lower and upper spaces. A few innovative variations included storage areas beneath the loft or integrated the loft structure with ladder access that doubled as shelving. The fan mechanism saw particular variation. Fletcher's original paddle design worked but required careful adjustment to catch the rising heat optimally. Other builders experimented with different blade shapes, multiple smaller fans positioned at various points, or passive venting systems that relied entirely on natural convection without mechanical circulation. What emerged was a design family rather than a single solution. The core concept, capturing rising warm air at sleeping level, remained constant. The implementation details varied based on local conditions, available materials, and builder skill. Fletcher also observed that the loft modification made cabins more adaptable to seasonal changes. In summer, when interior heating was undesirable, the loft space could be used for food storage, taking advantage of the cooler air that settled at lower levels. Some families hung dried meat or vegetables in the loft during warm months, using the elevation to keep items away from pests and moisture. The multifunctionality increased the loft's value proposition. It wasn't just a winter warming system. It was a year-round storage and space management solution that happened to also solve the heating problem. By autumn 1836, as families prepared for the second winter season with loft-modified cabins, the design's reputation was firmly established. The midwife reported that families with lofts had experienced dramatically fewer cold-related illnesses the previous winter. Trappers with lofts had maintained productive trap lines while others were cutting firewood desperately. The evidence was comprehensive and undeniable. Fletcher's simple modification had become a regional standard for frontier shelter improvement. The winter of 1836 to 1837 provided the ultimate test. A massive cold front descended from the Arctic in early January, bringing temperatures that would define the season as one of the coldest on record in the Wind River region. Fort Laramie, the nearest military installation with standardized weather observation equipment, recorded the conditions meticulously. Their log shows a sequence that explained the crisis. January 8th, temperature 22 degrees below zero. January 9th, 31 below. January 10th, 42 below. January 11th through 15th. Sustained temperatures of 40 below or colder. This wasn't a brief cold snap. It was a week-long Arctic siege that tested every structure and preparation in the territory. Trappers who'd survived previous winters with marginally adequate shelters now faced conditions that exposed every weakness. Fletcher's cabin, with its loft modification, handled the extreme cold remarkably well. The stratified air system meant that even when exterior temperature reached 42 below, the loft sleeping area maintained a minimum of 53 degrees, with a moderate fire burning until midnight. Floor level dropped to 38 degrees, cold certainly, but survivable with proper clothing and bedding. More importantly, the cabin remained livable. Fletcher's family could function normally. Children could play. Adults could work on indoor tasks. The space remained a true shelter, not just a marginal improvement over camping outside. Contrast this with standard cabins. Reports from around the valley told a consistent story. Families huddled around fires that burned continuously but barely kept interior temperatures above freezing. Some abandoned their cabins entirely, moving in temporarily with better-housed neighbors. Several families suffered frostbite injuries despite being indoors. The midwife made emergency calls to cabins where children were hypothermic despite multiple blankets and roaring fires. The Fletcher cabin became a refuge during the worst of the cold. One family from 3 miles away arrived on January 12th asking for shelter. Their cabin had effectively failed. Temperatures inside had dropped so low that water in metal pans froze solid 5 feet from their fireplace. They couldn't keep their 2 young children warm. Fletcher took them in. The loft space was large enough to accommodate both families, though crowded. The system handled the increased occupancy without significant temperature loss. Both families survived the cold snap comfortably, though tight quarters created social stress. When the Arctic front finally broke on January 16th, temperatures rose to a relatively balmy 10 above zero. The valley slowly returned to normal winter conditions. But the week-long deep freeze had changed perceptions permanently. Families in standard cabins had survived, but barely. The experience was traumatic: constant fear for children's health, desperate round-the-clock wood burning, and the knowledge that a slightly longer cold period might have killed them. Families in loft-modified cabins had remained safe and relatively comfortable. They'd burned more wood than usual, yes, but nothing like the desperate consumption rates in unmodified structures. Their children had stayed healthy. The adults had maintained normal routines. The contrast was stark enough that the upcoming spring construction season saw a dramatic shift. Nearly every family planning cabin improvements or new builds incorporated loft structures from the design phase. The latter loft transitioned from innovative modification to standard practice. Fletcher's documentation became invaluable during this period. The sketches, material lists, and time logs he'd created allowed builders to implement the design without direct consultation. The knowledge propagated faster than personal teaching ever could have